Hello all, and thank you for joining us. And if you've just tuned in, welcome to day 2 poster session of the Nature-Based Solutions Conference 2022. I'm Katrina Kendall, a member of the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative at Oxford, and the moderator for this session, where we will hear studies on nature-based solutions on the themes of Indigenous peoples and local communities, governance and finance from around the world. We will explore the importance of regulation and implementation with NbS financing, leveraging climate risk assessments for national governance, the importance of public perception, framing, local context, and considering social dimensions when designing and implementing nature-based solutions. And lastly, how nature-based solutions can support folkloric heritage-based livelihoods. And we'd like to invite all the audience members, please, to post any questions for our panelists that you have in the Q&A chat box. We'd love to hear from you. And to kickstart our session, I would like to invite David to start. Please, David, the floor is yours. Oh, David, you're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you, Katrina, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David Nemecek, and I'm the head of sustainability and banking at the International Sustainable Finance Center and the alumnus of the SOAS University. Today, I would like to discuss the topic of financing forest-oriented nature-based solutions and present to you the outcomes of my master's thesis research on the green bond market, specifically green bonds invested in the forestry sector, or the so-called forest bonds, a financial instrument that was first introduced in 2011 at a seminar organized by Climate Bonds Initiative, WWF, and Global Canopy. The instrument takes various forms. The structure of forest bond, for example, issued by IFC in Kenya, can be seen at the bottom center of the poster. But what is this research about? Conducting an iterative analysis of secondary data on 3 forest bond cases across Global South, bottom left corner of the poster, a bond issued by Fibria known as Suzano in Brazilian Amazon, by IFC in Kenya, and by Public Petroleum Authority in Thailand. I pose myself the research question of whether forest bonds manage to deliver on their promises as a sustainability financial policy, or even more specifically, whether there are risks that those aims will not be met. Based on review of policy documentation, these promises are divided into 3 main areas, hence the 3 pillars of the poster: the investment gap, the impact on nature, and the impact on society or local communities. First, forest bonds promise to tip the investment gap in forest solutions. Looking into data from the New York Declaration and the Bond Challenge on the investment need, and comparing those with the data from the Climate Bonds Initiative market analysis, we see that the contribution of forest bonds is in fact relatively marginal, somewhere in between 1% and 5% within a 5-year timeframe. One would say this is at least some contribution, especially when the global public funding into forests has not been enough. On the other hand, it shouldn't be ignored that the shift towards private market-based funding, such as through forest bonds, is in fact a deeply normative change of the governance of those forest projects. One element of such a shift is a change in accountability of governing institutions. As the green bond market is not a democratic system of elected players, it is not regulated based on voluntary standards and criteria, and with a questionable assurance system of second opinions. Markets also bring new pressures on efficiency and profits of forest projects. The ever-complex and unpredictable forest ecosystems are being simplified and made predictable. Forest bonds are found to be related to projects which lead to adverse outcomes for nature. Fibria is developing GMOs and planting invasive species that are reported to deplete local water reserves. IFC's enclosure interventions have negative spillover effects on local biodiversity. Equally problematic is the social context of some forest bonds. The engagement of local communities often does not go beyond offering unqualified jobs. Moreover, although political perspectives are usually ignored when presenting the projects, colonial injustices are perpetuated in Kenya, and the Thai forest bond finances projects with a history of enforced expulsion of local communities from afforestation lands. Now, all of those information are read as signals, not findings of complex enough research. To make stronger declarations about impact or alternative solutions, much more much more and deeper research will need to be done. Yet, I hope I managed to show that a debate around the types of financing of nature-based solutions should be critical, as there is a risk of time and money being wasted into greenwashing actions instead of real solutions. Even though the forest bonds in particular are a relatively new research topic and the data is scarce, green bond financing is being praised widely, and it is increasingly present in the nature-based solutions arena. Therefore, it should be targeted by critical research. Thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions or want to discuss details, get in touch either during the Q&A session or using the LinkedIn QR code on the poster. Enjoy the rest of this incredible conference. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, David. And yes, please, we'd like to invite your questions. If you've got any, please use the Q&A chat box. Up next, we have Micah. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, you should be able to see my screen now.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Micah Voss, and I'm working for the Berlin-based think tank Adelphi. And today I will present the results of the German climate impact and risk assessment, focusing on those aspects relating to nature-based solutions and especially the future limits of natural systems and resources to act as means to adapt to climate change. The climate impact and risk assessment for Germany, which we conducted between 2017 and 2021 on behalf of the German Environmental Agency, aims to provide a basis for the next German adaptation action plan. In the first step, climate risks without adaptation were analyzed, and assessing the adaptive capacity was the second step of the overall assessment. For this adaptive capacity assessment, experts were asked to estimate how effectively adaptation will reduce climate risks for the time period middle of the century for 2 cases of climate change, both based on the RCP 8.5 scenario. The results of this expert judgment, drawing on the Adelphi method, were the climate risks in consideration of adaptation. And actually, pretty much the same method was also applied for assessing the climate risks without adaptation. Adaptation in our case was understood as the realization of adaptive capacity by the implementation of adaptation measures to reduce the sensitivity of an affected system and/or to influence the spatial exposure. In total, we looked at 102 climate risks clustered in 13 action fields. And in a last step of the assessment, we then assigned those climate risks to 5 system areas to conduct an integrated assessment, really integrating all the sectoral results we had. I will now only refer to the results regarding the system area of natural systems and resources. And those results actually showed that there are a comparatively high number of climate risks for this system area, which encompasses, for example, climate impacts relating to ecosystems, soil and water resources, or species. So this means that the system area of natural resources is to be highly affected by climate change, considering a strong climate change scenario. And at the same time, the adaptive capacity in this system area was found to be comparatively low assessed by the experts. Climatic drivers which affect climate impacts in the system area were gradual temperature increase, drought and heat, strong winds, and heavy rain. Many of the climate impacts of the system area actually showed very urgent need for adaptation based on the climate risks, but also on the duration to implement adaptation measures. For a high number of climate risks, however, the experts also concluded that no direct adaptation seems to be possible. So with natural systems being comparatively highly affected by climate change until the middle of the century in Germany, also their ability to provide nature-based solutions seems to be limited. In my poster, I highlighted the example of the Wadden Sea. Thus, the wave dampening effect of the Wadden Sea is projected to decline with increasing sea level rise. Therefore, it might only be able to act upon a certain extent as a natural coastal protection structure. And this might only be the case for other nature-based solutions. As I already mentioned, also limits to adaptation were identified, especially with regard to climate risks in the action fields of soil and biodiversity. So in case of a strong climate change, several ecosystem functions might therefore not be available anymore in the future or only to a limited extent. So under current circumstances, autonomous adaptation of ecosystems might also take longer than required to adapt to ongoing climate change. Taking again the example of the Wadden Sea, for example, tidal flats might not be able to grow as fast as the sea level is rising or projected to rise. We therefore concluded that adaptation measures must aim to strengthen the system's own abilities to adapt by both relieving them from existing pressures due to habitat fragmentation, pollution, and overexploitation of resources, and also by avoiding a strong climate change scenario by intensifying ongoing mitigation activities and enhancing the efforts taken so far. Many thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Maike. Again, if you've got questions for Maike, please list them in the Q&A chat box. Up next, we'd like to hear, please, from Trisha.
Hi, everyone. I hope all of you are having a good time at the conference. My name is Trisha Gopalakrishna, and I am a doctorate student at the University of Oxford. And today I will be speaking to you about prioritization analysis of nature-based solutions. If you need to know more information about myself, please use the QR code that you see on the top right corner of the poster. So nature-based solutions are intrinsically multifaceted, resulting in a variety of ecosystem benefits and human well-being outcomes from conservation, restoration, and management of ecosystems. However, to maximize return on investments, information about where and by how much nature-based solutions can contribute to various goals of, say, climate change, biodiversity, and human well-being, we need to know this information to be useful for policy and decision making. Specifically, this information can lead to improved agenda setting for developing realistic targets. So like many countries, India has ambitious goals as part of its Paris and Glasgow climate agreements and the Bonn Challenge, specifically on the creation of additional carbon sinks via the forest biome. Similarly, India's national biodiversity targets to the Convention on Biological Diversity are wide-ranging. Also, India has ambitious economic and development growth trajectories for the next couple of decades, which needs to be balanced with its priorities for natural resource management activities, which is why the study is based in India. Here, I consider the nature-based solution of forest restoration and use a multi-criteria decision analysis to estimate the trade-offs and synergies between achieving the goals of climate change mitigation, habitat for forest-dependent biodiversity, and people impacted. I define forest restoration as natural regeneration of native forests only in areas that biophysically can sustain the forest biome. So how did I do this? You will see a schematic of the methodology on your screen now. First, I estimated the area of opportunity available for natural regeneration of forests to be 7.5 million hectares nationally by considering the biophysical and current land use and land cover constraints. This information is also available for each state. I then analyzed the cumulative carbon stocks that could naturally regenerate if this area of opportunity were allowed to naturally regenerate. And this, I estimated this to be 388 teragrams of carbon. And this is shown in the map, which shows the variation in the cumulative stocks that could regenerate across the sub-jurisdictions by the shade of orange or red that you can see. However, for the prioritization analysis, I actually used carbon sequestration rates of naturally regenerating native forests in the area of opportunity. For the biodiversity benefit, I calculated the additional forest habitat that would be created from the naturally regenerating forests for 44 forest-dependent, endangered and critically endangered mammals. This is shown by the donut plots on the poster that you can see. Each donut plot represents a species, and the green wedge is the additional area that would be created from naturally regenerating forests, and the remaining purple wedge is the remaining area of habitat. So for example, for the Salim Ali's fruit bat that you see on the right, forest restoration would increase its habitat by 39%. Similarly, for the Malabar civet that you see in the bottom right, the additional area of habitat that would be created would increase by 50%. I used a spatial conservation planning methodology as the multi-criteria decision framework. A spatial conservation planning framework has traditionally been used in prioritization analysis with the objective of delineating protected areas for protection of variety of biodiversity while minimizing financial costs. However, the core concept of this framework has now been extended to evaluating different scenarios of restoration strategies that could lead to an optimum combination of the desired benefits while considering constraints of resources like the area available, implementation, and opportunity costs. The foundation of this methodology is that it is a mathematical optimization problem. And here I use the integer linear programming algorithm because it allows for convergence of the closest optimal solution when compared to other algorithms in mathematical optimization. I optimized considering the minimum number of people impacted while setting a target of 17% of the area conserved, because this target is mentioned in India's National Biodiversity Action Plan. Preliminary results are shown on the bottom left two bar plots that I will walk you through now. In the first bar plot, the light purple shade shows the area prioritized when considering the total opportunity present in each Indian region. And this is 13.5% of the overall 7.5 million hectares. And in the second bar plot, you will see that it shows the people impacted if the 13.5% of the opportunity that has been prioritized were to naturally regenerate. On average, 104 people per square kilometer are impacted versus 365 people per square kilometer on the national scale. And this varies according to the region. I would like to conclude by providing some perspectives and future work. The key perspective is that this type of optimization analysis is one of many scientific tools and techniques that can be used when developing effective targets for nature-based solutions. The solutions from these optimization runs are not meant to be prescriptive because on-the-ground realities are starkly different when implementing and monitoring nature-based solution schemes. And as far as future work is concerned, I'm currently working on building a trade-off and synergy dynamic curve for different thresholds of the 7.5 million hectares. I have incorporated all forest-dependent mammals of India, considering all threat categories. And lastly, I've moved beyond incorporating just people affected, but I've included now people's reliance on forests for housing, construction, material, energy, and livelihoods. And I believe that this nuanced information about people's reliance on native forests would give us a better idea when it comes to optimization of areas that can naturally regenerate. So thank you very much. And yes, if you have any questions, please do post on the chat and do get in touch if you'd like to talk more about this.
Thank you very much, Trisha, for that example from India. Up next, I would like to please invite Sungju to share with us her work. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Sungju Han. I'm a doctoral researcher at the UFZ, Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research, as well as University of Potsdam. Today, I'm really excited to talk briefly about my PhD topic, understanding public attitude towards NbS projects, and I'll be look more in detail about a case of dike relocation projects in Saxony-Anhalt in Germany. So I'll briefly start with the background. Despite a lot of benefits and risk reduction effectiveness of nature-based solutions, as we all know, local people's attitude towards the projects were not always positive. Rather, sometimes, as we all know, resistance for the projects often become a project bottleneck. However, so far, current studies are largely lacking with empirical findings as well as theoretical backgrounds. So in this regard, I try to answer the key research question of my dissertation: what are the influencing factors for people's perceptions of nature-based solutions? So to explore more in this topic, I started to compare the conventional ways of dealing with flood risks and nature-based solutions. So here in this picture, Yeah, in the left-hand side, you see the conventional flood risk management. So the conventional way of dealing with flood risk is to build up a hard infrastructure, such as a dike here. And the idea behind the conventional approach is to make a distance between the source of hazards, in this case, the river, and the people. Therefore, the source of hazards and a place where people live is rather distant from each other. In contrast, in the case of a nature-based solution here in the right-hand side, if we follow an example of a dike relocation project, the dikes will be further away from the river shore, which makes additional space within the floodplain for the river during the flood. So like this. So it means that people should live more closely to what they could perceive as a source of hazards or uncertainty. So in this context, places where local residents make a living can be affected not only by the hazards, so flood, but also at the same time by the interventions, in this case, nature-based solutions. So large-scale dike relocation projects, for example, is something that makes changes to the place where people normally have affective feeling or attachment or emotional bonds. So with these reasoning, I have investigated how these two core topics, risk and place, makes differences in people's attitudes or perceptions towards the nature-based solutions. So in order to do so, we have performed a household survey in 5 towns in Saxony-Anhalt in Germany, where dike relocation and floodplain restoration was implemented. And the response rate was 46.7% with 304 questionnaires back. And I used structural equation modeling and to analyze 6 constructs that are inspired by sense of place, protection motivation theory, and a protective action decision model. So as a result, I was able to validate our theory-based framework. We named it as a place-based risk appraisal model, in short, PRAM, and it's under review. So, but I'm not going to tell all the details, but all 6 constructs, such as place identity, nature bonding, threat appraisal, perceived co-benefits, and well-communicated information, trust in local flood risk management, were actually showing a significant path to attitude towards the nature-based solutions projects. Particularly here, the place identity was demonstrating a negative path to the positive attitude towards nature-based solutions. That means when the place identity, that means people's bonding or attachment to the certain places, and people who have high place identity, they tend to resist against the nature-based solutions. For the nature bonding construct, people who have more bonding to the natural environment, they tend to believe more about the risk reduction effectiveness of NbS, but it was not significant for the support to the projects. And for the place, for the risk-related constructs, for example, threat appraisal showed the negative path towards the positive attitude towards NbS. That means people who have higher threat appraisal, they tend to have resistant attitude towards the nature-based solutions. And the other three constructs, such as perceived co-benefits and information trust in local flood risk management, were showing a positive path to attitude towards NbS. So I would like to wrap up with 2 points. So place is a container of a diverse human nature transactions that entail affect heuristics, that means affective feeling or attachment to the places, and risk appraisal. So therefore, public attitudes or perceptions towards nature-based solutions need to be understood with a heterogeneous place context to individuals and their dynamic relations with risk appraisal. So thank you. And if you are interested in more about my research, then please use the QR code in my Rio poster. I think that will be uploaded in the website soon, and to connect me in the research gate. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sungju. I just wanted to check if Mamoon was online with us as one of the participants. If you are, please send me a message in the chat. Thank you very much. Right, up next, I'd like to invite Carl, please, to share your work. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Katrina, and thanks for the opportunity to present. So my name is Carl Anderson. I'm a postdoc researcher at Ruhr University in Bochum, Germany, but I'm going to present work from my recently completed PhD at the University of Glasgow. And so this is kind of the third paper of my PhD, and it's on preferences for green, hybrid, or gray measures in relation to risk reduction measures in NbS host communities. And it was carried out within the Operandum EU project that was implementing nature-based solutions in different countries around Europe with the primary aim of risk reduction. And I just quickly acknowledge my co-authors there at the top of the slide, and as well you can see the kind of citation to the paper that this is referring to down at the bottom left. So the context is that these NbS were being implemented in the host communities. They were all in the mature planning stage of implementation. So not yet implemented, but there was an understanding that they would be, and the residents living within these communities were kind of aware of what NbS are and what was expected. So the research questions: do residents of nature-based solutions host communities prefer greener or grayer measures, and what factors influence their preferences? We used 3 European study sites and conducted citizen surveys. So in these study sites, NbS were planned to address hazards, natural hazards. In Caroline, Scotland, the hazard was landslides along the coast. Lake Puruvesi in Finland suffers from blue-green algal blooms and eutrophication, and the Spatial River basin in Greece is exposed to flooding. So we looked at citizen surveys at all 3 sites, and then we followed up the surveys with semi-structured focus groups in Caroline for slope stabilization and drainage. So jumping across to the survey results at the top right there, we found that there were slight preferences for hybrid measures instead of purely green NbS in all 3 of the sites. And we found significant negative correlations between preferences for gray measures, purely gray measures, and perceptions related to commitment to nature and the perceived effectiveness of the NbS. So higher commitment to nature, generally there was more resistance to purely gray measures, and the same so with higher perceived effectiveness of the NbS, more rejection of gray measures, and vice versa. Again, this is just a snippet of the paper, so these are some of the kind of more key findings. The focus group results, you can see there at the kind of top figure, this spectrum from green, hybrid to gray, and the 4 focus groups. There was some variation in terms of preferences on the spectrum, but generally they kind of coalesced around hybrid measures, so not wanting something completely green or something completely gray. Directly under that, you can see some of the factors that were pushing or pulling preferences towards one side or the other of the spectrum. So on the green side, it was mostly perceptions in relation to cost, aesthetics, effort, and habitat, whereas on the gray side, it was more related to risk perception, perceived effectiveness, the evidence base, and awareness, knowledge, and skills. Whereas different perceptions regarding elements in relation to time kind of put people more or less on the in the middle in terms of hybrid. So things like how quickly the measure will be effective against landslides, and then kind of the long-term maintenance and other considerations like this. So one quote that summarizes one of the key findings from the focus groups was, because of where we live and because of the sea, somewhere we need to have something more robust than just the green measures. We're not necessarily in favor of the gray, but we're also not against it. If it's needed for the risk reduction piece. So this gets to this one key finding, that the gray measures were preferred over what were perceived as more uncertain green if necessary. So people really wanted, the measures to succeed. This was the main the main thing driving the preferences, and this was despite really highly valued co-benefits. So this is really a beautiful kind of coastal community, and the residents there had a really high commitment to nature. A lot of them lived there because of the beautiful, the aesthetics and the habitat and all these other things. Despite that, these measures were really framed in terms of success or failure for risk reduction. So it kind of suggested that regardless of the degree of co-benefits that we offer, there would still be this perceived kind of failure if the risk reduction part of the equation didn't meet expectations. The hybrid measures were seen as kind of the best of both worlds, so limiting the trade-offs of both kind of ends of the spectrum. And then some residents perceived the NbS as kind of more of an experiment, while others had higher expectations for the effectiveness and thought that they were really already, proven and will definitely be effective. So there was this kind of variation in expectations. So just quickly, some of the kind of, I think, further research that's needed is in relation to framings and co-benefits. So if we're really, I think there's a potential to overemphasize co-benefits in some of these situations, particularly like this, where the residents really wanted, demanded success in terms of risk reduction first and foremost. I think in some cases, there should be more consideration of gray elements. So moving closer towards this hybrid, possibly as a stepping stone towards, kind of societal stepping stone towards more green measures, but also just if there's really high demand among locals and host communities for hybrid measures, I mean, this has to be taken into consideration, because any measure that's implemented is going to need, the uptake for the co-implementation and the long-term monitoring and protection. Lastly, providing evidence certainly is necessary, and then above all else, meeting the expectations in terms of risk reduction, because you can imagine, the next storm comes and the measures don't work, there's going to be a backlash against NbS. So therefore, we really need to be transparent in terms of setting expectations and making sure they're kind of aligned with evidence. So I'll stop there. You can feel free to email. My co-author Alejandro is actually there in person, so if you can track him down, you can also ask him more about the study, and look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Carl. And now for our last speaker, I would like to invite Mamoon to take the stage. I just wanted to know if you were able to accept the panelist invitation.
So good evening from Sydney. This is Abdullah Mamoon. I'm a doctoral researcher in Western Sydney University. Thank you for giving me the chance to talk in front of you. So today I want to talk about the advancing inclusive natural climate solutions to restore ecosystems and revitalize folkloric heritage-based livelihood for resilient local communities. So in Bangladesh, folkloric heritage-based livelihoods that depend on ecosystems are increasingly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, alongside growing urbanization and increasing globalization. However, the natural climate solution can play a significant role in helping communities, those are engaged in folkloric heritage-based livelihoods, to become more resilient. So this work has the objective to understand how natural climate solutions could reduce climate change's impact on folkloric heritage-based livelihoods, and how it could help to restore ecosystem services that is aligned with SDG 13. So in the theoretical underpinning, I have tried to follow the cultural ecology theory and socio-ecological models to explain the reasons for their relevance in this research. My study area was Rajshahi. It is basically dry northwestern region of Bangladesh that experiences low rainfall paired with high temperature and humidity. So what I have done for the methodological section, land use and land cover, geospatial analysis, So through these analyses, I find that significant anthropogenic climatic impact for human activities and natural elements on the landscape of Rajshahi in Bangladesh from 1990 to 2020. At the same time, I have used the participated rapid appraisal method. These methods are followed by purposive sampling and open-ended questionnaire in key informant interview techniques to collect data and conduct qualitative thematic analysis. So in the results and discussion section, this study finds that human-induced climate change and socio-ecological challenges. Human-induced climate change and socio-ecological challenges, including globalization and urbanization, have an impact on the human condition as well as traditional culture, society, and nature. The capacities of ecosystem, communities, and individuals are being affected to adapt to climate change for unjustifiable land use and land cover changes, deforestation, loss of biodiversity, pollution, in agreeing with the IPCC report 2022. One of key informant interview shared their experience with us. Now most of the ponds have become extinct, meaning that the ponds have been filled. Besides, various types of building, community centers, business centers have been built on those ponds. That is why there was a time when there were many small canyons along these ponds and reservoirs, rivers. So this study wants to conclude that a global concern for climatic stressors is aligned with various anthropogenic determinants that cause vulnerability for folkloric heritage-based livelihoods at the local level. This research also argues that natural climate solutions needs to address the inclusion of local communities in transforming the adaptation strategies from anthropocentrism to ecocentrism at the local to national level. The inclusive and ecocentrism natural climate solutions could help to conserve folk heritage, recover folk communities' livelihoods, and restore ecosystem for sustainable future.
Great, thank you very much, Maroon. And now we'll move on to the Q&A portion of this poster session. We had a question come through on the Q&A. I can see, Carl, that you answered it there in the chat box, but would you like to also reflect that on that live as well, Carl? It was a question from Alina, which asked, thanks for the interesting presentation. Could you explain what we see on the second scale of the focus group results, and how did you assign these push and pull factors to a particular point on the scale? Carl, would you like to elaborate a little bit more on the answer that you've given in the chat box for the benefit of the others on the call? Thank you.
Yeah, sure, thanks. Yeah, and thanks for the question. It's somewhat of a technical question, so maybe I won't need to elaborate so much, but yeah, it's just based on the frequency of responses, so the number of participants that make an argument in terms of their preference for a measure on this green hybrid gray spectrum. So number of participants that make the argument, and then number of kind of total times the argument is made across all of the groups. So this is how it's kind of positioned, and it's a somewhat subjective, somewhat quantitative, somewhat qualitative kind of process. So it's explained in detail in the paper also. You can take a look there.
Great, thank you. Thank you all to the panelists for all of your sessions. I thought it was very interesting to hear some similarities in the work, particularly of your work, Carl, and your work, Sungju. Very interesting to see sort of similar studies looking at the perceptions of local communities when implementing nature-based solutions. It's a theme that we've seen recurring throughout the conference that we've had, and particularly today during our session with the IPLC communities. I was wondering if you had any reflections as the panel on how we can really ensure that there is a mechanism for giving a voice to the local communities that are in place at the nature-based intervention sites. Do you have any kind of practical for those that are practicing NbS on the ground about how to do that? And I'd like to ask that to either Carl or to Seungju. Seungju, perhaps, would you like to share any thoughts?
Yes, of course. Yeah, I worked with a dike relocation project in a small towns actually in Germany. So I cannot really say that dike relocation can be a representative how to say sample for all nature-based solutions. But in the case of a dike relocation project, I have already mentioned it during my presentation, but place attachment, how they feel about the place was actually a very important factor that actually impact people's perceptions towards NbS. That was very obvious during my survey. So, but when we talk about the nature-based solutions, we talk about all the good things. So the ecosystem services, also human well-being, biodiversity. We all know that it's good, but from the perspective of our residents, they don't think about the soil nutrients or ecosystem services. They rather think about, oh, there is a place where I can walk a dog, for instance, or there's something that relates to their place and their real life. So I think when it comes to people's perceptions or in general successful implementation of the nature-based solutions, we have to bear in mind that we are dealing with the people who live there, not the experts who know everything. Well, not everything, but at least we know the good things about nature-based solutions. In this case, in this sense, I think trust building and as well as effective communication is very essential to have good relationships with local residents, as well as to convince them about nature-based solutions.
Thanks, Seungju. And Carl, do you have any reflections there? And whilst we'll be with you, can you also answer Eric Hubbard's question from the University of Cape Town, who asks, Carl, have you looked at the application of your work in an urban environment?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I can add on to what Seungju mentioned there, and actually we have some similar results in our PhD, so it's nice to be like presenting together as well and answering questions. Also, so yeah, I actually did also look at place attachment, connectedness to place in my research, and found that also to be quite a strong variable in terms of the public's acceptance of the nature-based solutions. And then also from the qualitative side, all three of the study sites that I looked at, the residents had a really strong kind of historical and cultural connection to the location. And yeah, so I mean, it became clear that, for having a successful project, we needed to connect the work that we were doing with these perceptions of the history and the culture, and also, clearly make the argument, not just make the argument, but also follow through that what we were doing was in line with their perceptions of the place, and not, changing the status quo too much, and only changing kind of, yeah, like I said, in line with kind of their expectations. Your question, Katrina, was more about kind of giving these kind of local people voice. And I think I can say maybe from the methods I used that I think it worked quite well was starting from this really broad array of considerations in terms of what's important for the locals. So it wasn't just place, but also, perceptions in relation with nature. So starting from even this kind of like philosophical, like what are the, relationship with nature of the people living there, because if you're going in and saying this is a nature-based solution, then you need to understand, how that's already perceived. And then the risk perception aspect that Seungju already mentioned was also crucial. So Eric's question, have you looked at application of your work in urban environment? Unfortunately, that was going to happen, but because of COVID, it became impossible. We had Dublin as a case study site as well. I think that some of the results would probably be similar and some different. It would be really interesting, I think, in particular in relation to this perceptions of place and place attachment, because like I said, in my sites were rural, and for example, one of the results was that some people thought that, well, there's plenty of nature already out here, you know, why do we need more nature? So that argument fell a little bit flat, whereas I can see in an urban environment, you know, there would be a much greater appreciation for that. But then on the other hand, there was this really close connection of like kind of the rural cultural identity and the landmarks and the history and all these other things, which probably is not always going to be the case in an urban environment, especially if you have people that have, you know, just recently moved there or don't feel as connected. So it would be good to try to replicate some of this in an urban environment.
Great, thanks for that. I'd like to ask a question to Micah. We heard from you a bit about how, you know, in this rapidly changing world, how we can start to look at nature-based solutions in a slightly different way. And I was just wondering, given these limitations that you described, how we could overcome them, given the rapidly changing world that we're in, into ensuring that nature-based solutions can be successful over the long term.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for the question. Yeah, I think those were also the 2 points I mentioned at the end of my presentation. I think one of the points that we really highlighted out in the climate risk assessment was that actually natural systems have to be relieved from existing pressures that are upon them, and which also might hinder their ability to act as nature-based solutions. But on the other side, we also really urge for ongoing climate mitigation activities, because we acted with a strong climate change scenario. So in a weaker climate change scenario, also nature-based solutions might not be that affected.
Great, thank you. I've got a question for David. Given a lot of the discussion, the great discussion that we had earlier, and the concerns that were shared surrounding anthropocentrism and the concerns surrounding financing, I was wondering if you could give some insights on how we can ensure that nature-based solutions financing considers the importance of NbS to deliver on multiple outcomes for people and nature beyond climate change mitigation, and also all the social dimensions and the perception and values and all of the great work that we heard from the results from Sungju and Carl, and how to ensure that these values and local communities are respected. Do you have any thoughts on that? I'd like to ask that to David in the first instance, and would open that to whoever would like to answer that as well.
Thank you, Katrina, for the question. Certainly, I don't think this is necessarily only a question of financing, although, you know, financing, as I was trying to present, is inherently normative in itself. So, you know, it's good to look at different alternatives of financing and, you know, what those entail when it comes to, you know, social and ecological outcomes, you know, the concept of governance of different types of financing. At the same time, ensuring that there is necessary oversight of the financing and of the impact of those investments, and, you know, there's a feedback mechanism from the local communities. At the same time, I think it is quite necessary to look at it from not just the perspective of financing, but also, you know, of governance, which is a much broader issue.
Thanks, David. I've got a question now for Tricia. I saw on your poster that some of your follow-up work will be focused on the trade-offs and synergies of the nature-based solutions outcomes in India, and this was a huge theme from yesterday's discussions. And I was just wondering if you'd like to elaborate a little bit more on that work that you've got planned, and if you've got any early insights that you'd like to share from case studies on the ground in India.
Well, I'm currently working on it, and what we've hypothesized is that the more of the area of opportunity you would target for any sort of restoration. I'm looking at natural regeneration, but even if you were looking at some sort of active method of actually planting seedlings and seeds, there would be more trade-offs, especially when it comes to people in a place like India, because India is such a densely populated country and there's hardly any area left for any sort of restoration, at least. So what we've hypothesized is that as the area that we are targeting for restoration increases, the trade-offs would also increase. And that's just a hypothesized curve. It's just a linearly decreasing curve. And with regards to your second question, which is, are there any anecdotal evidence, as you said, about such sort of trade-offs and synergies? Well, specifically for forest restoration, which is one of the NbS strategies, there is a lot of literature from different parts of India, and also from different parts of the world, that if you are obviously restoring for just carbon, then you can get away with just monocultures of fast-growing exotic trees, which would not do well for water and would not do well for biodiversity. And there is consistent evidence from different native forest restoration experimental plots all across India that is showing this, is that naturally regeneration of native forests is the best sort of strategy when it comes to multiple benefits. And there are other sorts of trade-offs, especially with water, that is something to keep in mind. But again, not much of this sort of nuance is addressed when thinking about policies and also thinking about targets. And this is why my research looks into providing those sort of targets of area, say, which is area metrics for forest restoration is such a ubiquitous way of going about, and that's why you have bond challenge in Paris Agreement that says 125 million hectares needs to be restored, etc. So that's where this research is going. It's about figuring out realistic targets of how much area we need to restore and how much benefits we would get and how much of the benefits we would not get, because there would be a trade-off. So yeah, that's at least some sort of anecdotal evidence from people who are actually doing experimental analysis. My research is mainly modeling sort of analysis, and I take their published data.
Great, thank you very much, Trisha. To round up, because we've got 5 minutes left, in the theme and the spirit of Nature-Based Solutions Conference 2022, which is to support thriving human societies and ecosystems, I'd like to ask each of you in sort of 30 seconds or less, or in a short phrase, how can we ensure that nature-based solutions support thriving human societies and ecosystems? I know that there's a lot of things that you can say on that, but maybe if you can just give a short phrase, something to end off our session, that would be great. Mike, I would like to start with you, please.
Yeah, thank you. I would say one way to ensure it is really to act on participative approaches, so really to include all stakeholders relevant for planning and implementing nature-based solutions. Yeah, that would be my key message.
Great. Thanks, Micah. Mamoon, how about you?
Yeah, well, thank you. Let me share one of my key insight from the stakeholder. That a particular stakeholder told me our current approach is the anthropocentric approach. When everything is happening related to the purposes of human directly, this anthropocentric thinking is the root of all destruction. So the crisis of present world originated from the problem of anthropocentrism mentality. So we need to change our mentality from anthropocentrism to ecocentrism.
Powerful, thank you.
In the light of naturalism philosophy.
Thank you, Mamoon. David, how about you?
I think I'll follow up on the previous speaker saying that it needs to be locally based. and locally meaning not just anthropocentrically speaking, but also, you know, looking into the most ecological context of those solutions. As you know, global governance structures seem to have certain bottlenecks. So yeah, really, you know, governing from the local, both social and ecological context is essential.
Thank you. And Sungju, I'd like to invite you to share.
Yeah, in 30 seconds, for one keyword, I think building up a trust. Trust is important. I think we have to have a trust to nature, and also we have to build up a trust for local people that they can be persuaded by the us scientists as well as practitioners.
Great, thanks. And Trisha, how about you?
I think everyone have summed up their last points very well. And I think I'd like to conclude by saying that being inclusive and understanding the context and how that plays into including the right stakeholders and the kind of communities that are involved is, I think, key for better implementation of NbS.
Thank you. And Carl, last words, please.
Thanks. So I would say that we shouldn't assume, especially from like a project perspective, that this kind of no regret or win-win framing is shared by the people in these like local NbS host communities, and that rather we ensure that what we're providing is aligning with kind of the values and demands, so that we're meeting expectations and that NbS continue to kind of be seen in a positive light and uptake continues.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Carl. Thank you to all our panelist speakers for this day 2 poster session. Thank you to the audience members who participated. And we'd like to conclude this session here. Over to you back in the Natural History Museum for this afternoon's sessions. Thank you so much.